Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Mustard Seed Leadership Podcast. We are starting a brand new 5-part series, so I'm glad that you are joining us today. And this new series is called Developing the Leaders Around You. I've visited many churches and been to many different nations, and many leaders are not intentionally developing leaders. And I want to talk about a practical plan for implementing that, becoming intentional about raising up leaders around you. Now, Jesus, once again, is the incredible model. In Luke chapter 6, verse 13, it says, "When morning came, Jesus called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them whom he also designated apostles." Jesus was very intentional about this. He ministered to a crowd, but he invested in the few. And that's huge, because the key to impacting the many is investing in the right few. Let me say that again, because I believe this with all of my heart. If you want to impact many, the key is to actually invest in the right few, because they are going to multiply your effectiveness and your capacity. So, 5-part practical plan for developing leaders. And we're going to just look at part 1 today. And I want to start with the why. Because here's the thing, if you're not convinced about the importance and the need for developing leaders, then you're not going to be doing it. And I think that's the reason many people don't. And so I'm going to give you 3 reasons today why intentionally developing leaders is so important. Simon Sinek, who does a lot of TED Talks, a lot of leadership development, he wrote a book, Great Leaders Start with Why. Why? You have to be convinced if you're going to make the changes. So, reason number 1 of why it is so important to develop leaders around us, because God works his purposes through people. Now this is huge. You would think surely God would use just angels or lightning bolts or no. God has chosen to work his plans and purposes through you and I, through people. And he needs someone to put their hand up and say, "Here am I, Lord, use me." That's why leaders are so important. Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 30. Every time I read this verse, there's something inside of me that cries out. It says, "I looked for someone," this is God speaking, "I looked for someone among them who would build up the wall and stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land, so I would not have to destroy it, but I found no one." And doesn't something inside of your heart say, like, "Lord, here am I"? And that's exactly what we read in Isaiah 6, verse 8. "I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?' And Isaiah said, 'Here am I, send me.'" Now that's a leader. There's something inside saying, "Lord, I'm available. I want you to use me." God has chosen to accomplish his purposes and plans through human instruments. The more leaders, the more people around you who would be willing to say, "Lord, here am I, send me," the more God can do. The more of his purposes and plans can be accomplished through you and your organization. I remember in the early days when my wife and I had just planted a church, well, we had no leaders. It was just the 2 of us. And so in some ways we were very limited in terms of what God could do because there were so few leaders. Now, 20 years later, we're walking in the fruit of seeing more people. It's not just my wife and I initiating ministries. Actually, other leaders are doing more, initiating more, and so God's purposes and plans can be multiplied. God does new things through people who are willing to lead. Reason number 2 why developing the leaders around you is so important, because the growth of your organization is capped by a lack of leaders. Literally, there's a ceiling. Most churches or organizations, they don't grow in a nice linear fashion. They will grow until they reach a ceiling. And then you break through the ceiling, it will grow until you reach another ceiling. Those ceilings are determined by the leadership capacity of that church or organization. I'd love you to read Acts chapter 6, verses 1 to 7. I'll just pull out a couple of those verses. Verse 1, it says, "In those days when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food." In other words, the church was growing, and so were the complaints and problems. Why? Things were starting to fall through the cracks because now the church had outgrown its leadership capacity. And what would have happened? More people would have been added, and more people would have left because they complaining because they were hitting a ceiling. So what happens? Verse 2, "So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, 'It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the word of God in order to wait on tables.'" When your capacity has been reached, you have to neglect the critical things to run after the urgent things. The very thing that caused the growth, good ministry and preaching and prayer, was now being neglected because they had to run after and help the feeding scheme. So verse number 3, "Brothers and sisters, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them and will give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the word." What was the solution? Build up a leadership team. Choose people, invest in them, hand over responsibility so that they could lead as a team. And the result, verse 7, so the word of God spread, the number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly. There it is. They made the adjustment, they enlarged their leadership capacity, and as a result, the church continued to grow. John Maxwell said in his book, 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, under the law of the lid, he's basically said everything rises and falls on leadership. That's why if you want to grow your church or organization, it starts with you. You have to enlarge your leadership capacity, which will in turn enlarge the leadership capacity of those around you so that the church can move forward. Any organization will hit a growth ceiling when too few people are trying to do too much. The way to break through a growth ceiling is to enlarge the leadership team. Average size of church in America, according to statistics, is between 65 and 89, which is the perfect size for a single person to lead that church by themselves. Now imagine how the average would change if all those single leaders began to develop the leaders around them. It would bring the average up considerably. The organization cannot grow beyond its leadership capacity. Third reason why it's so crucial, because it reduces burnout and ineffectiveness. Exodus chapter 18 verses 13 to 26 is a beautiful passage. I'll read 2 verses. Verse 14, when his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this you doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" And in verse 17, Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you're doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone." And too many leaders are burning out, stressing out because they're carrying it all by themselves. Tyron Daniel, leader of the New Covenant Ministries apostolic team, says God's solution to increased burden is shared burden. And shared burden means empowering and training leaders around you so that you can work as a team. So, discovering there are other people in your organization who love doing what you hate. It was a beautiful discovery I made in my life. And actually, by empowering them, training them, you can hand over responsibilities to them. They can do it better than you, and together as a team, you can go so much further. If you fail to build away from yourself by investing in others, you will eventually be of no use to others, because you burn out and people get dissatisfied because they do not have access to their leaders. So here's the challenge. Until you are absolutely convinced of the need to develop the potential leaders around you, you won't. And I hope I've convinced you today. 1, God works through leaders, raise up more leaders, and God can accomplish more of His plans and purposes. 2, because your church or organization is capped by the leadership capacity, you have to grow more and better leaders to take the church into more of what God has for you. And because by sharing the leadership load, you will be more effective for longer, and the people you lead will have greater access to leaders. There it is. I hope I've convinced you. It starts with this. You need to be convinced why growing leaders around you is so critical. I hope you have been convinced. May God burn it into our hearts. And I'll see you again next week for part 2. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Remember, if you'd like the notes that come along with this episode or any one of our past episodes, you can visit outlookchurch.co.za/mustardseed leadership, where you can see all our past episodes, all the resources and notes that go along with this. Until next time, keep growing.